Good on YouTube. And we good on Rockfin. All right, everybody. What is going on? For those of you who have been tuning in from my last few streams, you would know that we had some sound issues, but hopefully those have been reconciled. As I have gotten some, I got a new connection. I think it was an interface issue, and it wasn't vibing with my iMac or with my MacBook, excuse me. So you know how that goes, Apple problems. But hopefully it should be reconciled because I have a very special guest here to talk about her new book. Anya is an investigative journalist, an activist, probably not like without question one of the most brilliant people that I know, but I would say probably one of the most brilliant minds in the world. 100%. Don't act shy now. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, you know, we already know. It's okay. She is absolutely one of the most brilliant minds in the world, a contributor to the Gray Zone as well. Welcome to the show, everybody. Anya Parampil. Did I pronounce that correctly? Parampil?
Yes.
Yeah. See? Pays to pronounce it before the shows, guys. You gotta try it sometimes. Nah, usually I butcher names, so because I only have 4 letters in mine, so it's really easy to remember. So, Anya, you have written a new book that you said took about what, a year or two to write, exposing the coup in Venezuela, and it's called Corporate Coup in Venezuela in the fall of the U.S. empire. Tell us first about like what inspired you to write a book about it, because I know that you talked about it. I actually learned most of my stuff in Venezuela from you and Max and Ben. So I know you talked about it, but what inspired you to write a book specifically about this topic?
Yeah, people, your audience might be familiar with some of the work that Max and I and the Gray Zone put out following the U.S. recognition of Guaido in January 2019. That was when the U.S. rolled out this unprecedented coup attempt where they declare it mission accomplished before they'd actually changed the government by just recognizing a parallel regime that no one had ever even heard of. Juan Guaido, 80% of Venezuelans, according to a poll at the time, didn't know who he was when the U.S. recognized him, but that didn't matter because Mike Pence had a phone call with him and apparently liked him. So it all worked out in Guaido's favor then, and they recognized Guaido. And I spent, over the course of 2 years, then I took 3 separate reporting trips to Venezuela, all that were for over a month about each time. So I got to know the country well in terms of just what it's like on the ground, but I also developed sources really across all ends of this political spectrum. So a lot of people maybe seen my interviews with government officials in Venezuela, but I also have contacts in the Venezuelan opposition. I have contacts on the U.S. political side of things, and on Wall Street and international financial and the oil industry. So I felt as though I had a unique story to tell because I, during that time, put together a series of investigative reports exposing, for example, the characters in the Guaido coup regime as basically just corporate assets. They claim to represent the interests of the Venezuelan people, but when you looked into their biography, what I found was that they were pretty much various representing, Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's ambassador, was really just an Exxon lawyer who had sued Venezuela's government and fought them in terms of when they were trying to nationalize their oil wealth, or Guaido's top prosecutor in the eyes of U.S. courts, Jose Ignacio Hernandez. He was actually a paid witness of several corporations that were suing Venezuela's government in court. So he had a major conflict of interest there. And actually, what I document in the book is how he took steps once he took over in U.S. court, in the eyes of U.S. courts as the official legal representative of Venezuela. He took actions and set the stage for the unprecedented looting of Venezuela's U.S. stored wealth, including Citgo Petroleum, which is a gas company or oil. People would know it as a gas station in the United States, but is actually Venezuela's largest international asset. All now on the verge of liquidation, thanks to actions taken by this coup government. And so because of the original work that I had and the sources that I had, I felt as though I could tell a fuller, more complete story in a book, really get into the characters and fun details that I couldn't always put in my articles, and share information that also didn't make it into my articles.
Wow. So that was a lot. I know, like, so you remember, lived in Miami, knew a lot of Venezuelans. We had a great time in Miami. It was a great time. We had, like a lot of family fun. I felt like I was part of the family by the time we were done, y'all. Y'all got to go to Miami, eat some food, chill out, relax. You talk about literally everything under the sun except for politics when you hang out with your political friends in Miami. I promise you. So with that being
I love
said,
Miami too.
yeah, but look, I'm telling you, I love Miami. I just hate living in the U.S., which is why I'm in Rio, because it's the closest thing to Miami without being in Miami. But being said, when you go to Miami, you'll notice there's a lot of Venezuelans there. There are a lot of quote unquote expats, and I talked to a lot of Venezuelans, and a lot of them, they're either usually extremely anti-Maduro, of course, but most of them are just kind of confused because the entire situation is very convoluted. And all they knew is that there were problems that weren't getting resolved, and it seemed like no one had any control over it. But what I had noticed consistently, even amongst the conservatives, was that they had no idea who Juan Guaido is. And people would say that even the conservative opposition in Venezuela didn't really approve of Juan Guaido. He just kind of showed up. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes. In fact, there are reasons that Juan Guaido, when he was elected president of the National Assembly in 2019, this was right before the U.S. recognized him as president of the country. A lot of people in the opposition were surprised that his party picked him because there were more senior party leaders, people that were much more well-known across Venezuela and outside of Venezuela. And they selected this unknown lawmaker. Well, then when the U.S. turned around and recognized him as president, it made a little bit more sense. And one Venezuelan journalist I spoke with at the time said it really just came down to his looks. He doesn't look like the typical Venezuelan extremist opposition figure, which are tend to be from the European lineage, linked back to former colonizers in Venezuela. He looked, in fact, Trump apparently even said this himself, that he looked like Obama, kind of. And actually, so he was marketable. Or maybe Trump didn't say that, but he called him, I think, Beto O'Rourke, which to me equated him with just a cheap Obama knockoff.
That's actually a brilliant, accurate description. Like, yeah, you look Hispanic and you kind of act like it, but are you really? Like, he looks kind of indigenous. Talking about Guaido, he looks indigenous enough that he doesn't look like the casual, average European Venezuelan. Yeah, that's true. I guess I think about that. Yeah.
That was perhaps why they selected him, but I'm not sure even Juan Guaido knows who he is. That's the real sad thing about his character. He's kind of an empty shell. And then all of these figures from the Venezuelan opposition and from the U.S. administration pretty much took advantage of him, and he was in way over his head by the time this coup regime was actually on a roll.
Yeah, I mean, that's usually actually what the United States does. They don't just do that with foreigners. They do that here. They take advantage of people like Kamala, for example, who was Indian until she wasn't. The presidential election came, all of a sudden she was, doing Beyonce moves and singing Beyonce lyrics and quoting Nicki Minaj. But before that, it was, I have such a deep connection to my Indian roots, and people didn't even know she was Black. So Obama, same thing. Cory Booker, I would say, same thing. Even though we know he's from the hood because he wouldn't stop reminding us during the election. But it seems like they take advantage of people who are seeking validation because they are unsure of who they are within a society that generally tends to judge based off of what category they can fit you in. So that's pretty apt description. So do you talk in your book about that weird, uncomfortable, awkward situation that I guess was supposed to be a takeover of the palace, where Juan Guaido live streamed full portrait? Like he was like this. He didn't even widescreen it. Like he was like full portrait mode, talking about, hey, everybody, let's come storm the palace. And his grandma didn't even show up to support him. Do you talk about that in the book?
Yes, there is a chapter that is called Guaido Swing for the Fences or something like that. This was a year after the initial recognition. So this was in January of 2020, when his term as National Assembly president was expired. And so he had to get reelected by the Venezuelan National Assembly, the opposition once again. And by then, a year into his coup regime, he'd squandered so many of Venezuela's assets, including, as I mentioned, Citgo, and he'd failed to take over any substantial support, government ministry, anything in Venezuela. So the opposition was really frustrated with him. In fact, he did damage to the opposition because they could no longer go out in the street and demand regime change and take on the Maduro government because they had to pretend as if Guaido was already in charge. And so it put them in this really bad position. And
that's actually hilarious. So that's awkward. Yeah, that's awkward.
It was just a disastrous policy on every level in that way. But then at the last minute, Guaido thought he was just going to be anointed president of the National Assembly again. This other figure, Luis Parra, also from a U.S.-backed political bloc, from Guaido's bloc within the assembly, challenged his candidacy, and it became this big drama where, I mean, if you watch video of the actual vote inside, while lawmakers are voting, they're all screaming at each other, they're jumping on top of desks, because what happened was Guaido, he couldn't not show up for the vote, but he didn't have time to whip up votes and take the temperature of his colleagues to see whether or not he was actually going to win.
He actually didn't know how to be a politician, basically, because he was never actually a politician. Is what you're
exactly. Saying. And so instead of just refusing to show up, what he did was come to Congress with 2 lawmakers from Amazonas state that were suspended from the National Assembly. They were suspended, and I give all this history in detail in the book. They were suspended because they were accused of vote rigging, or there was audio back when they were elected that came out of Amazonas state where a local official was bragging about having paid people for votes, and the Supreme Court demanded an investigation into that state. And including a Chavista lawmaker from Maduro's socialist bloc was also banned. And basically the opposition there refused to participate in an investigation into the vote. And so these figures from that state were not allowed to come into the National Assembly. So Guaido grabs these 2 guys who weren't allowed to come in and tries to force his way in through the front door. There's then all this video of him confronting Venezuelan police outside. And he claims, and Western media claim, that he was not allowed in. But there's video of him very clearly being told, the Venezuelan police say, you can go in. The other 2 lawmakers are the ones that have to wait outside. But he tells his colleagues, I'm not going in unless we all go in, and then ultimately runs around the side of the National Assembly and tries to climb the fence.
Oh, he put on his best AOC hat, huh?
Exactly. Kind of performative behavior that's very AOC, where he then created the image that the media blasted around the world, just showing him wobbling on top of the fence saying, Guaido's blocked by Maduro because they don't. He's such a threat. Maduro wouldn't let him into the National Assembly. When, I mean, in reality, if you had any integrity, that would be a pretty embarrassing stunt to pull.
Yeah. Well, in reality, if Maduro was the man that Guaido in the United States and the neocons claimed him to be, Guaido would be in jail.
Yeah.
I mean, under U.S. law, he might very well be executed because technically what he did is treason. Over multiple counts of treason. So he's lucky to still be alive. And obviously, I feel like that's probably Maduro showing grace and proving that, yeah, this is probably what I should do, but I'm not going to give the U.S. what they want and do as the U.S. would do in a situation like that. So it's admirable, but he a better man than me, because Guaido and all his colleagues would have to go. They would be sitting right next to Julian Assange, and Julian Assange would be free. That's how I feel about it. So
yeah, I mean, it's controversial within Venezuela among supporters of the government, and even within the government, there were officials who expected him and wanted him to be arrested very early on. But it was a political decision, really, to say it's bait. They were basically dangling Guaido out there as bait for Maduro to take, and he didn't bite.
Yeah, smart. Maduro is much more intelligent than what people give him credit for. So now, obviously, Venezuela is a little bit stressed economically, but it's not really any different than what's going all over Central South America, and to be quite frank, the rest of the world. Where is Venezuela at right now? in regards to obviously the constant and regular interference from the United States, and them trying to navigate the economic damage that came from suffering through the pandemic?
Yes, Venezuela has recovered its economy from the worst times, which were 2015, 2016, right after the Obama administration handed down the National Security Declaration that said Venezuela was an extraordinary threat to the United States, though didn't exactly say why. After that moment, shipping, because once the US makes a policy decision like that, it actually has an economic effect. If you're a company shipping products to Venezuela, the insurance premiums suddenly go way up because the US has essentially put everyone on notice that there could be a war, or that the United States is going to target Venezuela financially, which can also blow back against private companies and even state companies. So because for so long under neoliberal development, Venezuela was mostly dependent on imports for basic goods. The West just treated Venezuela as a giant oil well and then shipped it all of the basic supplies that it needed, like toilet paper and
I remember
formula, those kinds of things. That's how neoliberalism works, right? Sovereign countries aren't supposed to develop it themselves. We give it to them as long as we can take all of their resources. We give them all the cheap products they need. And
I'm glad you clarified, because people think that like they don't have necessities. And what I try to explain to people is like, no, that's actually not what happens. They take the shit that like you need. It's like the most irritating thing. It's like when people say, what are you going to do to get back at your girlfriend? Oh, I'm going to take her eyebrow tweezers. I'm gonna put, something like that. Like, no, I don't need it, but yeah, I kind of need it. And that's the type of quote unquote famine that you see. But the necessities, a lot of the times Maduro is able to provide the like bare necessities like food, housing, and things like that. But corporations that are obviously on behalf of the US take things that you need in your day-to-day life away and make it hard for you to get. Not that it's not available, it's just they don't give it to them. They don't make it available to the public.
Right, which is why it's important to stress that though Venezuela described its political project as socialist, and this shouldn't necessarily just detract from that label that they claim, it is true that 60% on average of the economy throughout this whole time was still controlled by the private sector. So when it comes to who controls the grocery stores, who controls the imports, who controls the pharmacies, it's still throughout this period largely controlled by the private sector. Imports, in terms of the basic goods that were, I'm saying, affected by this national security declaration, were managed in large part by the private sector. And then even throughout this period, there were several instances of the government discovering major warehouses that were filled with toilet paper, because essentially the elite class was hoarding it and trying to complement the US sanctions by just doing what they could to strangle Venezuela's economy, because they also wanted the government overthrown.
Because then people say, "Oh, look, the government's so poor there, they can't even afford toilet paper in grocery stores." When that's
exactly. And so this all created a supply shortage throughout 2015 and 2016. This is when Maduro launched CLAP, the program to, as you say, start providing basic household goods subsidized by the government to millions of households, Venezuelan households, on a monthly basis. They did these monthly shipments to get people cooking oil, beans, rice, pasta. That's a whole nother story. But eventually, Venezuela did begin to recover some of its import capacity by partnering with other countries. They didn't necessarily need to only rely on the West, they found. And then the inflation comes along as Trump comes in, ratchets it up sanctions against Venezuela, bans the sale of Venezuelan oil on U.S. markets in conjunction with his attempt to install Guaido as president. And by the time I first went there in 2019, their rate of inflation was at an all-time high. We're talking thousands %, a number that we couldn't even comprehend. And it did take time, but they did implement a monetary policy to eventually roll that back as well. And then COVID came along and kind of messed with the whole world, the whole region. But Venezuela...
Yeah, and then the U.S. tried to implement sanctions on Venezuela in the middle of the pandemic that people keep forgetting about. Yeah.
Right. And so the one point that I'll make is it's such a hot story in New York right now, all of these Venezuelan migrants who fled. And at least from what I've read, and I plan to go talk to them myself and do a report on this, but I'm willing to bet the vast majority of them left Venezuela back in 2015, 2016 during that serious supply shortage and crisis. And then they ended up in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, in all of these other countries, which, as you say,
Brazil. There's a lot of Venezuelans in Brazil.
They were propagandized into thinking that life would be better in any of those other countries, and then got there and found that it actually wasn't. And then when Biden came in and implemented TPS, special status for Venezuelan migrants, since they really started coming to the United States. But these people, I'm willing to bet, are not, though some of them, especially after TPS, that really encouraged people to come directly from Venezuela, but many of them had already left years before at the height of the crisis. And Venezuela even has a program now planned, Vuelta a la Patria, where they return migrants from the region that want to actually go back home. They have government-sponsored flights back home, and they have an initiative to kind of corral these people and bring them back to Venezuela. Just 85 people were returned yesterday on a flight from Trinidad and Tobago, I think. But migrants in the United States don't have access to that kind of help because we don't have any relationship with the Venezuelan government to this day.
Yeah, I mean, if it makes them feel better like that, U.S. citizens don't really have that kind of help most times because our government's trash. So really quick, can you talk about this? Because a lot of people, when we're having this conversation about Venezuela, they always say, well, it's Venezuela's fault that they're in this problem. They're having these problems economically because why didn't they diversify their economy instead of only relying on oil? Now, I try to explain to people, but I probably make it really way too convoluted. So can you simply explain why that is BS? Because you and I know, obviously, that's not the case.
Yeah, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves and gold reserves, untapped gold deposits in the world. Oil was discovered in Venezuela a century ago by Royal Dutch Shell. And then ever since that moment, once the West discovered the vast depths of Venezuela's reserves, private companies, Western companies, pretty much took over the country. They wrote their laws. U.S. Standard Oil would actually write Venezuelan laws. And, then eventually through the IMF neoliberal system really took a hold of Venezuela and made sure that its economy was always approved by foreign corporate and capital interests of foreign capital and corporations. And so it was when Chavez came in at the turn of the century, elected in 1998, held a constitutional referendum in 1999 that redefined Venezuela's oil reserves as property of the state. And then he embarked on these things don't happen overnight. He began to actually go on through the process of nationalizing Venezuela's oil reserves and kicking foreign corporations, including Exxon, out. And during that same process, Venezuela did begin an initiative to diversify its economy. But because, as I explained, it was essentially this oil well for the West, it was a petrostate, and its legacy as a petrostate stretches back decades, way before Chavez ever entered the picture. It was completely dependent on its oil earnings and on foreign imports to supply its basic necessities. And that was by design. And so Chavismo has only been in power for a little over 2 decades. They did seize land from oligarchs that were living abroad that just had acres and acres of property, farmland that was sitting dormant, and begin to try and revamp agricultural production capacity, and which is a big one for any country that wants to have sovereignty. To be able to produce your own food is a major.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a benefit. You can't be a U.S. or really any country basically you can't be the U.S. I mean, the countries that can provide agricultural goods to export, the WTO basically prevents them from doing so in various ways at a high degree. So yeah, you need to be able to, but you need to have that land in order to be a dominant superpower in that regard.
So it took work, and it's controversial once you start seizing land, and there's legal fights, and you also then have to retrain your population to want to go back to the land and become farmers, take them out of cities. So it's a generational and years-long process, but Venezuela has began it. part of their new constitution, their revolutionary constitution, is that there are actually 4 branches of government, not just the traditional 3, but a 4th called the communes, which is really an officially recognized system in Venezuela of these communal networks that operate farms and other production centers across the country, but on their own sovereign basis. And so I even haven't spent enough time learning about that process. Other people have. George Chicarello Maher, for example, wrote a great book about that and the strides that Venezuela is making in terms of how to break away from its dependence on oil and to diversify its economy.
Dope. So I want to shift gears really quick, if you don't mind. This, because you're part of the gray zone, and you guys recently got hit by GoFundMe, where they basically just tried to rob you guys with $90,000, if I'm not mistaken, a little bit more than that.
The people.
Yeah, rob the people, definitely. Both of y'all. Like, the people wanted the money to go one place, and y'all obviously were going to take care of journalists so they can do their job, do more great investigative reporting, like what you've done in your book. And so what it's like personally to have big tech basically arbitrarily decide to remove a whole source of income from you. So I'm curious as to what you feel about this situation with Russell Brand, with YouTube just demonetizing him and over a weirdly obscure policy that doesn't actually make any sense and doesn't really fit the description, but also the letters that the UK government sent to both TikTok and Rumble.
The fact that there's a letter from the UK government sent to these tech companies should tell us everything we need to know about the assault on Russell Brand, because to me, it was so clearly orchestrated by powerful interests and people that wanted to shut him up. And it was coordinated by these British media outlets that are basically just fronts for oligarchs and the intelligence community, as they like to refer to themselves. So I have no doubt that these allegations against Russell Brand would have never made it to publication if he never opened his mouth and started talking about corporate government takeover or the global agenda to restrict our freedoms and access to our like central bank digital currency. He's done great work on that, for example, and just critiquing the media on so many issues that people like you and I have been speaking about for years, but because he's this A-list celebrity that was, a star in the tabloid press
and uniquely popular in 2 major countries. Like, it wasn't like he's just popular in the US or just popular in the UK. He's almost more popular in the UK, but he's still insanely popular in the US. So it makes him unique in that regard.
Yeah, he carried a special brand, really. And he was dangerous when he came to the US and went on that tour de force, taking on Bill Maher and so many other tools of the corporate establishment. I think people really wanted to figure out how to shut him up. And we've learned that sex allegations are the best way to do that, because no one can really defend themselves against it. People become also too cowardly to rally behind you and support you when those kinds of accusations come down. But, really, I wasn't that. If this was the worst that they could come up with, a Hollywood elite.
Yeah, that was self-admitted drug addict. Came from a very dark place. Like, if that's the worst.
Yeah, and I saw Candace Owens make this point really well. Just that, why didn't we hear about all of this when it was going on, when he was in it? Why is it now that he's sober, married, and about to have his 3rd child, and speaks openly about how he's reformed, and he also spoke openly about the darkness of his past? Why is this the time that they've decided to target him? It's very, very bizarre.
Yeah,
but when it's not, it's
bizarre and convenient. Right before the election, isn't it? It's always right before the U.S. is about to have like some major election or something big is about to go down, that they target. I mean, I would say probably the same thing about Tucker Carlson. At first, I was under the impression that Tucker had chose to leave, and then apparently that's not the case. So you have Tucker removed. Let's see how long it takes for them to go after him. You have Russell, who I actually consider Russell a leftist. I don't know why people stop considering him a leftist. In my opinion, he still has extremely leftist ideology. It's just that he's more than willing to hold people who call themselves leftists accountable when they're clearly just neocons in disguise. But like, clearly it's indiscriminate.
Or
the only thing that go ahead.
Or global pro Davos globalists.
Exactly. Exactly. It's
apparently there are a lot of on the left.
Yeah, the left, right. Exactly. So what's crazy to me is that the UK snitched on themselves. That's what I got out of the letters. Because before, remember, they were saying people easily could see, yeah, this looked like a coordinated attack. Like I said, I'm not going to render judgment on whether somebody's guilty or not guilty. That's for the courts to decide. I will say that after you look at all of the details do matter. And I would encourage you all. Oh, actually, Kim Iverson does a great job breaking it down. So for you people who hate to read, go look at her video. She does a great job breaking it down. Like, yeah, some of it might make him like, yeah, that's not cool. But he doesn't do anything illegal based off of the women, like the story and the allegations that the women put forth. He doesn't do anything illegal, which is probably why you guys hadn't heard about this from, like, say, a police department or something like that. That's why there are no police reports, because technically they're airing out their grievances because a media company went to them and asked them to do so. And they frame the stories in such a way that it assumes guilt, or people are seeing it through a lens, perhaps, for example, because they're from the US, like with the 16-year-old situation, like that's just a weird situation. You shouldn't be doing it. But actually it's legal in the UK, and the relationship was consensual. So they take these things that are obscure, a little bit controversial, problematic even, and say, like, this is the character of this man and who he's always been. Therefore, you shouldn't take him seriously.
And then they're daring everybody to defend him.
Exactly. Because they want to know who else to go after, basically, of course. They want to know who else to go after. But at the end of the day, the UK government gets involved and starts writing letters to TikTok and Rumble, and what in the letter they actually say, yeah, he's already been demonetized on YouTube. He's already lost his management deal. He's already lost his book deal. He's already lost his agency. But we're just a little bit worried that he can still make some money on your platform. So it makes it pretty clear what the goal is. And it also lets you know who was behind it. Because what the fuck? I don't know. Like, why are you writing letters?
Exactly. It shows they were ready, just as everybody was ready with columns and every other newspaper was ready with the front page story. I have a feeling that there are people in Hollywood that we still celebrate that are guilty of worse crimes, and that we don't hear about it because they still serve the interests of people in power. And Russell Brand's main crime, in my view, was that he became a class traitor and started speaking out about the system that used to control his life when he was in Hollywood. And so people that used to be part of that network around him resent him for it. And the people at the top of the food chain certainly resent him for it. And this is his punishment.
I also think that Russell Brand potentially laid out a blueprint for those who are looking, who know what's going on, who probably grew up when they were a celebrity in Hollywood. They grew up around this network of people where they know exactly who controls what, who pulls what levers, what's right and what's wrong, and have really always been terrified to leave that space because, maybe they're the first they're first. Well, usually in Hollywood that's not the case, but they're the ones providing for their family. They're the most successful. They do have livelihoods that they have to maintain, and they're scared that if they leave, they won't be able to do so. However, at least in the case of people like Russell Brand, he's showing that there is another way. And what they want to discourage is that anyone else follow that blueprint. I like I said, I'm pretty sure Tucker Carlson's probably about to get attacked at some point coming down the line. Now, I think it'll be maybe a different attack because he's conservative. So a lot of that stuff that they would say maybe about a former liberal like Russell Brand won't stick. Like, you can't be like, oh man, Tucker Carlson said racist stuff. I'm like, yeah, probably. Like that's probably what's going to happen, and conservatives aren't going to care. So, but that's coming for him at some point, in my opinion. And it just lets you know, it's what people need to understand is that there's a difference between right and wrong. Yeah, we know what is right and what is wrong. There's holding someone accountable for what is right and wrong. That's also important. But also, there is the necessity to understand the reason behind why something is being elevated and something else for whatever reason is being ignored. Like I said, I just found it interesting that Tara Reid, her story, which was credible. I mean, probably one of the most credible stories against a politician that I have ever heard. And that the allegation in and of itself wasn't enough in the minds of the media to disqualify Joe Biden from being president, but it's enough, but allegations that are basically, I didn't like something that he did, although it was consensual. I just didn't like the way he went about it. Like, those allegations are enough to disqualify somebody's entire life. And no one think that that's weird?
Yeah, and again, just the fact that there's government pressure on these corporations to then demonetize him and come after his livelihood and try and ruin his family life. It's not easy, I'm sure, to have these allegations coming out when you have children and your wife is pregnant because you've tried to leave that past behind you. It's just, you know, you get the feeling that Hollywood is a really, really sick place and that everybody who's in it, there's a dossier on them for the minute that they leave, that they know they're pretty much.
And they're reminding
you. Speak out the way Russell Brand did, we might be learning more about other people in Hollywood, because I think it's a disgusting, horrible place.
Of course, yeah, 100%. I mean, California in and of itself is just a disgusting, horrible place. I'm sorry for my California people, but y'all know how I feel like California. I've always called Hollywood fake Miami. Like,
hey, I'm technically a California girl, so I take offense.
Yeah, like, it's true. Like, y'all act like y'all really got nice weather all the time, but it's really only like 40% of the year y'all have nice weather, and you can't swim in your water because it's, you know, cold as shit and full of Fukushima. It's just Fukushima nuclear waste just chilling in y'all water. Y'all like ain't there.
Miami beaches are way better.
Yeah. So, but the reality is that you, like you said, I would agree. It's probably a dossier basically on almost everyone, and they are basically showing that they can pull that dossier up whenever they like, the moment that you decide to step out of line. And you're basically in the sunken place. And that's what I basically call Hollywood. It's like the sunken place where you can know right from wrong, but you're still going to do what you're told because your entire livelihood, your brand, everything you've ever known is reliant on it. So what I do want to talk about what you have coming up next, because a lot of people, while you were gone, you know, I know you were, you know, just kind of working on your book, but a lot of people while you were gone, they missed you, Anya. They were like, "What the hell, Anya been at?" They ain't seen you on RT. They haven't seen you in interviews. Like, now that your book is out, what are you going to do next?
Hopefully travel around and meet people who want to read it and talk about it and do some sort of book tour. That's definitely on my agenda. And then just continuing the kind of coverage that I was doing before I stepped away to do my book, and then have picked up since. So, for example, going to the BRICS summit and trying to get a picture of what is really a big theme in my book. It's not just about Venezuela and the war on Venezuela. Another major theme is the multipolar world that is rising in opposition to the decades-long Western financial war, weaponization of the dollar, and this neoliberal system that didn't actually serve the former colonial powers. Now these countries are forging a new system, forging a new way of relating to each other economically, and also ultimately how they will relate to us in the United States and the West. So I want to learn as much about that world and as much from people all around the world who are working on it to really understand what our future is. And actually, I think there is a place for the United States to play in this multipolar world. I think we would be better off after some pain if we abandoned this zero-sum imperial project and actually just started engaging in the world as a normal country. And a lot of that starts in the Americas. It starts with how we treat our immediate neighbors, as opposed to just treating them like our own backyard, right?
What's crazy is, like, the rest of the world is just asking the U.S. to not be psychopaths. Yes. That's all. They're not asking for a lot.
No, they don't want to destroy the United States. This isn't an anti-American or anti-U.S. initiative. No, they just want to survive. This is out of their own interests and preserving their sovereignty. And now we've gone so far as to alienate even our allies, such as Saudi Arabia, to a degree. So the world is changing much, much faster than I think people in the United States realize. And so my mission is to try and communicate that to people here, because ultimately what I want is what's best for this country. And I don't think our policy toward Venezuela has made sense even out of our own interests. We have to give up on this idea that we can just own the world. It's not good for us to own the world because we're draining our own resources and tax base to do so. But we also can't do it anymore. We just can't get away with it. So we should just learn about other countries and what their interests are, how they developed, and kind of just accept the world for what it is instead of constantly trying to change it.
Yeah, and and I feel like there's this idea in the US, because there are, like, obviously the people like you and myself, and I think a growing number of people who understand like the US needs to change, and that like everyone isn't a sociopath like the US pretends they are. Like, you know, the US calls literally everyone who they don't like a dictator, and then the actual dictators that they're friends with, they act like they're best buds. But like there's still a section of the US that is convinced that every world leader is just as greedy as the US is, and given the opportunity would immediately try to take advantage of the US. But that's just not the case. The ones that are that greedy, I could pretty much say, at least the ones that have significant power, the ones that are that greedy were put in power by the US. If I'm not, I mean, that's pretty safe to say.
Or our allies. Europe is really the primary beneficiary, I think, of this relationship, because they don't have to defend themselves. We pretty much supply them with a military, and then all of our imperial wars for us in the United States, a lot of the things that we're gaining abroad are things that we can find in our own country at this point. I mean,
everything, literally everything.
And so, but Europe, they aren't necessarily in the same boat. They kind of need this neo-colonial, neoliberal system to last indefinitely. I mean, maybe that's how they get away with still having the kings that we fought against centuries ago living on in power in these European capitals throughout the continent. So they, I think, are the ones that are taking advantage of us. The rest of the world, Russia and China, you know, anyone who's fear-mongering about either of those two countries, I think, have missed the plot. They're not paying attention. Russia and China have no interest in coming over here and doing anything to us. They know that if they wanted the US to collapse, the best thing they could do is just stand back and watch.
That is very true, actually.
But I don't think anyone wants the US to collapse, because it wouldn't be good for the world. They would like to have a secure US with a stable economy that actually produced things and exported things other than weapons, took care of its own people, was concerned with what's going on within its own borders, instead of going around and destabilizing the world. I mean, that's all that they want.
Yeah, I would say that the world was probably in its best place economically, with like just a exponential level of growth, when the US was producing the goods that it could produce within the country, and people were acting in, you know, trading and exporting and importing in good faith. Like that's how the world kind of like the actually past the Industrial Revolution, really, like the world like grew rapidly. And it's because, I mean, don't get me wrong, we were still doing stuff that was bad, but it was nowhere near what we're at right now, where all the money's fake. Basically, it feels like only thing we export really that is weapons, it seems like, and we sell weapons to everybody. We buy weapons, like we write checks for ourselves and put them in our own bank.
We import food. I mean, that's outrageous. We should be able to grow and produce a lot of our own agricultural sector. Like we should have a thriving agricultural sector that's not industrial. That's you know,
it's true. I mean, we produce our oil.
Not selling all of our land, our agricultural land, and to Bill Gates, and all of our suburban properties to BlackRock. Like if we were focusing on reversing that and actually taking care of the people here, and again, having a productive economy, we deindustrialized thanks to NAFTA. We just don't have a real economy. We have this digital information economy that's fake and inflated, and has just produced a laptop class of people with no social skills whatsoever. And the real American worker has just been beaten down.
Yeah,
And
I
so
feel like the US is literally the definition of fake it till you make it. They have taken fake it till you make it to imperial levels. Like, because it's we're on the no, not on the verge of collapse. The US has already collapsed. That's how good they are at faking it until they make it. They will literally look at you in the face like, yeah, Bidenomics is totally working. Well, there's more homeless people and more kids like that don't have food on the table than ever before. Yeah. Come on, bro. Have you looked at a movie lately? Look at all those suburban houses. Will we lie to you in films about the state of the U.S.? That's how it's literally faking until you make it. And but I don't know how long I'm gonna be able to fake it. Is where we're at right now. Like it's going to get bad. And I do think that we have to take a step back as people, educate ourselves, realize once again that the rest of the world is not as sociopathic as the leaders of the U.S. Just like they realize, if you go to most countries, they actually are fully aware that the people of the United States are not representative of the leadership and vice versa. They don't like just bomb. Like that's why you don't hear about Russia randomly bombing U.S. soldiers, even though they are fully aware that U.S. soldiers are where they're not supposed to be. And the reason why is because they understand that those soldiers are following orders that are largely based off of propaganda and getting passed down from people who have no interest in the lives of those soldiers or the people that are afflicted. Like people are more commonsensical in other countries. And if we just played our role, we wouldn't be collapsing. There wouldn't be this depression. But then that just lets you know, like Anya said earlier, this isn't really to help the people. The decisions that the United States are making are not to help anybody, but a very, 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 very small few. Because now corporations apparently are worth more than people. Anya, let people know when your book is coming out and where they can get it. Actually, I know if you can get it, you can pre-order it in the link below. I'll put the link in there. But when is it coming out?
So if you order it from the publisher's website, OR Books, it will ship and come out in November. That's when we'll have hard copies. If you order it through Amazon or a third party, I think that date is more like January, because first it goes to the publisher and then from there it ships out. So if you want it in November, and also if you want to just support my publisher instead of Amazon, which I would prefer, of course, and then you can go to their website and you'll get the book earlier. So orbooks.com.
Yeah, so cool. So the link is in the description, everybody. Make sure you go pre-order the book right now. I'm definitely getting a copy because, well, it's never too late to learn how the U.S. does regime change in Central, South America, and really all over the world. And this is one of the most brilliant minds that you can learn that process through. And hopefully you can take that knowledge and educate those around you, because it's one thing to know what happened. It's another thing to just be aware, okay, it was the U.S. that committed the regime change. But this type of information is how you see when another one's coming, right? That's how a lot of those unique experiences that Anya was able to piece together, that unique type of knowledge is how people immediately knew, like what happened in Bolivia, that was a coup. And it was a right-wing coup, and it was a coup done by the U.S. It took people like no time to figure it out. Why? Because of excellent reporting and investigative work on places like Venezuela, like Anya, Max, others at the Gray Zone, Glenn Greenwald's done in Brazil. Like that type of work is so important, and you can use that information to educate the people in your life, so that we can just stand up to those who are in charge of us and take accountability in the only way we can. So Anya, thank you all so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Are you still streaming? Do you go on a Gray Zone stream still?
I will be increasing my presence on the Gray Zone streams that happen Friday, and then hopefully start doing my own. I enjoy being on camera, but I don't love it as much as I used to. But when I have important interviews or something unique that I feel like I can bring to the table, I will definitely be streaming at the Gray Zone YouTube channel as well. And the last thing I just want to say about the book is, it is about the playbook of regime change, but it is really also about this world that's rising against it and how our policy is blown back. This book isn't about being anti-American. I love this country. I want it to be doing better. And that's why I think the sooner we accept reality, the sooner we can actually make this country into what it's meant to be. Because right now we're kind of failing in, I think, the mission that our founders envisioned, and everyone since who believed in our country as a as a positive project, a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Kind of failing is really putting it nicely, honestly. But thank you all so much for tuning in to this live stream interview on For the People podcast. You can support the show by supporting us on Patreon. You can also become a premium subscriber on Rockfin. All those links are in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe to the Telegram channel, which is also in the description. You can do that for free. You can keep up with all content and breaking news updates from me. Other than that, people, always remember, more than anything else, find your balance. Peace.